distinguished participants, faculties from various colleges, and students. It is extremely a proud moment for the Department of Political Science to organize an international webinar as part of Al-Hajj PK Kunyusab webinar series and also in association with IQAC MSM College Kayangulam. The department had organized a few webinars in relation with various topics, and we are planning more webinars in this context. I'm not going into the details of these programs. Let me move to my official duty. I would like to express my sincere thanks to our manager, MSM College Kayangulam, Alhaj P. A. Hilal Babu sir, our principal, Dr. Geeta Kumari ma'am, our vice principal, Dr. Mohammed Taha sir, our education secretary, Dr. Amina ma'am, and our IQAC coordinator, Dr. Neetu ma'am, in their absentia. I take this opportunity to welcome our resource person, Mr.
നമസ്തേ എടാ എനിക്ക് ഓഡിബിൾ അല്ല കേട്ടോ ആരും സംസാരിക്കുന്നത്
Vishak Madhusudanan, postdoctoral associate
കേൾക്കുന്നില്ല
at the School of Studies, University of Sussex, and talks on
ഞാൻ എനിക്ക് ഒന്നുകൂടെ
Islam
റീഡ്
tradition
ചെയ്തിട്ട് ജോയിൻ ചെയ്യണം ഒരു മിനിറ്റ്
globalizing world, a study of Sunni Muslim
ശരി ശരി
identity, formation in contemporary
ഓക്കെ
Kerala.
ഓക്കെ
I think it is one of the interesting topic in the context of Indian politics also. On the behalf of Department of Political Science, I extend a warm welcome to our resource person, Mr. Vishak Masunan. And I also welcome our distinguished participants, faculties of various colleges inside and outside Kerala, and also welcome our colleagues, Advaita teacher, Anasar, Dr. Jayaprakash MG, behind this organizing the webinar, and also faculties of MSM College, and the organizing team behind this webinar, and also all the students participating from various colleges. And I welcome one and all to this session. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I request Ms. Akhiha Mohammed to introduce our resource person.
Those who believe that politics and religion do not mix understand neither. Just remembering the words of Einstein, it is with great probity that I am pleased to welcome Dr. Vaishak Madhusudanan to this international webinar. He is a postdoctoral research associate at the School of Global Studies, University of Sussex. He is currently working with the Muslim fishing community of Vizhinjam, Trivandrum, as part of a research project that aims to make South Indian artisanal fishers' livelihoods more secure and sustainable by improving safety at sea. He completed his PhD from the Indian Institute of Technology, Madras, 2014 till 2020, and was a visiting Fulbright Nehru Doctoral Fellow at the Department of Near Eastern Studies, University of California, Berkeley, from August 2016 till May 2017. His research interests include sociology of religion, globalization, Islam, religion and development, social theory, and identity politics. The theoretical shifts wanted to enrich our intellectual imagination about the religious identity as a social and political practice in a globalizing world. Dr. Vaishak Madhusudanan would share some of his ideas on the topic Religious Identity in a Globalizing World, Sunni Islamic Traditionalism in Contemporary Kerala. Vaishak sir, I cordially welcome you to this session in order to demystify this topic.
So please unmute.
Hi, am I audible now?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay, fine. Yeah, I thank MSM College and Anas for inviting me for this webinar. So, without much boring introduction, Hello? I hope I'm audible.
Hello, sir.
Yeah,
Yeah.
fine. Okay.
Yeah, sir.
So I thank Anas and MSM College for inviting me for this webinar, and without much rather boring introductory remarks, I'll directly get into the topic of our discussion today, which is of that of religious identity, basically. Before we enter into the content of the talk, let's have a brief reflection on why do we need to talk about religious identity in this contemporary moment that we are living in, especially in India. Because religious identity is all around us right now, especially more than ever. If you look at the recent uh, uh, act by our Prime Minister, where he laid the foundation stone for the Ayodhya temple, and the Uttar Pradesh Chief Minister uh, Yogi Adityanath, commenting that he wouldn't be going to a Muslim mosque function if there is a construction of a Muslim mosque in Ayodhya. Everywhere we kind of have references to religious identity, especially in our political discourse, which and not also to mention the CAA, Citizenship Amendment Act. And everywhere, religious identity is being talked about, especially in our uh, in our current political dispensation. So, in that context, it becomes not just academically relevant, but also politically imperative to talk about religious identity. Not just to talk about religious identity, but to understand religious identity as to how it is articulated in our political discourse. That is the primary, at least. Given the political juncture where we stand, I think that is the most important reason why we should talk about religious identity, because has come to revolve around the question of identity, religious identity, so much. And if we don't talk about it, it will be a great political mistake. And so, what do we mean by the term identity? Before we go into religious identity in a globalizing world, what is identity? Is the fundamental question that we're dealing with before contextualizing it to the context of globalization. So, identity has been a pet concept in social sciences, particularly from 1960s onwards. Before that, of course, Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung and other psychology, like psychoanalysts, have talked about identity, mostly dealing with the question of self and the individual, etc. So we are not looking into the psychoanalytic understanding of the self or identity or those kind of questions. Not to say that they're irrelevant, but that is not the scope of the discussion. We are not talking about personal questions of self or the questions of identity. Rather, we are dealing with the question of group identity formations. So, from 1960s onwards, there has been a upsurge of interest in the concept of identity in social humanities and social sciences, uh, mostly from people like Erving Goffman, Peter Berger, Luckman, and all these people have started talking about identity in much more significant terms than ever before. And also, it is important to note that this was also a time when a lot of anti-racist movements and ethnic movements, uh, feminist movements, all these got strengthened even globally. So there is an integral connection between what is happening uh, in our social and political realm with the concept of identity and the academic interest in the same phenomenon. So, of course, this is also a time when post-structuralism, queer studies, culture studies, all these got more attention. Uh, I'm talking about the period of 1960s and 70s. So identity became one of the most importantly talked about concept within humanities and social sciences from that period. Um now, methodologically speaking, what is identity? And then how do we understand the question of identity? For the for the time being, I'll be using the terms self and identity interchangeably, even though there are significant difference between these two terms. Um, so, uh, if we talk about one of the major theorists who problematized the concept of self or identity in recent times is Michel Foucault, who who forcefully argued how the concept of power is central in uh, understanding identity, and to suggest that identity or the question of self is not something that is innate or inherent or something that you're born with. So Foucault contests all such assumptions of a priori notion of an identity or self you are born with. Rather, self or identity is understood as a constructed phenomenon, a phenomenon which is closely linked to how power works. Uh, so that was Foucault's major critique against the earlier understandings of identity uh, or self, such as that of Freud or even other um, Enlightenment thinkers, also other Enlightenment thinkers, and also Foucault. So this was his critique of, um, you know, such Foucault's critique of uh, Bloomer or symbolic interactionism school, or even people like Freud. So, according to Foucault, it is a much more it is a process that is closely integrated to the concept of governmentality, how the power structures govern you through disciplining your body, through institutions like prisons, clinics, and other institutions in society. How the self is a process that is constructed socially and politically through exercises of power. That is the primary premise in which I will be talking about the question of identity. I'm not limiting my analysis to the Foucauldian framework, but rather to suggest that identity is understood in my talk as an unstable, ever changing, dynamic category rather than a uh, uh, unitary entity that you're born with. Rather, it is a constructed phenomenon. That is a premise. That is a premise on. That's a premise in which I talk about the question of identity.
വിഷയം ഞാൻ ഇടപെടുകയാണ്. മൈക്കൊന്ന് ചേർത്ത്
ഓക്കെ,
ശബ്ദം കുറച്ച്.
ഇപ്പൊ ശരിയാണോ? Now it's fine.
Okay.
Yeah. So that is the primary premise in which I talk about identity, the question of identity and the question of power, how power influence your conception of identity. So far I have talked only about Foucault and how he criticized the earlier conceptions of identity and self. Now also we have theorists like Anthony Giddens and Ulrich Beck. I'm not mentioning all of them, but I'm only picking few whose conceptions have been central in understanding identity. So how does Giddens and Beck, for instance, understand identity? So they locate the question of identity in our late modern period. Late modern period is a qualitatively new phase in modernity, where there is a questioning of the instituted principles of modernity, like nation states start to get questioned, the boundaries set by the nation state gets questioned, and new questions like ecological concerns come into picture, and what sort of modernity are we following. Modernity gets criticized for its capitalist underpinnings. Modernity gets criticized for its culturally homogenizing nature. Enlightenment ideals like rationality, reason, scientific progress, all of these concepts get criticized. So that is a period which we call as late modernity or high modernity, for that matter. So Giddens and Ulrich Beck locates the question of identity in the context of late modernity. They understand the question of self understand the question of identity as a reflexive project of the self. So if Foucault would argue that self is a concept that is externally constructed, I'm only talking about the early Foucault, where he will argue that institutions like prison or clinic or church or other institutions creates yourself. Giddens and Beck would argue that the self and identity is not only created by these external influences, but also the agents, the individuals have an active role in shaping the identity. So it is not just the external forces acting upon you, but your active engagement with those external forces. So that is how Giddens and Beck would understand identity. So identity seen this way is a very multifaceted, unstable, dynamic category. So this is one of the major premise which even our political situation demands when we talk about identity, not to give in to any sort of essentialist arguments about identity, whether it be the identity that Hindutva would love everyone to believe, or the political Islamists would like others to believe. So this is the sort of a counter argument to that, to argue that identity is not an essentialized category. So now, from this premise, now we move on to the question of globalization. So what is globalization? So I'm just dealing with this basics so that our the ground of discussion is very clear when we move into Sunni Islamic traditionalism. So what is globalization? So globalization, a lot of theorists have, of course, started talking about globalization from 1990s onwards, particularly Roland Robertson, Arjuna Padurai, Peter Berger, Wallerstein, Manuel Castells. These people have talked about globalization focusing on different aspects. For instance, Appadurai would talk more about cultural globalization. What happens to our understanding of culture in globalization? Wallerstein would talk about what happens to our economy, or rather global capitalism in globalization. And likewise, the list goes on. So, and Roland Robertson and others would again, like Appadurai talks about the emergence of a global culture and the rise of a planetary consciousness. Uh, so, what happens in globalization? So, after reviewing a lot of literature and other stuff, one get a reasonably good picture about certain essential phenomena that we can attach to globalization. One is the emergence of a global culture. Uh, like basically with all these communication networks and the growth of internet, our understanding of culture is not limited to our immediate regional circumstances or even the boundaries set by the nation state, especially in a world of Netflix and Amazon and all these digital platforms. Culture is definitely not something which we can confine within the boundaries of the state or even regions or localities that are more close to us. So, so global cultural flows is one of the major uh, 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 influence or major changes in globalization that happens with globalization that Appadurai focuses on. And also, we have the transnational networks coming in, big corporates, the international, the multinational companies becoming a major phenomenon in our times. And it is no longer India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, UK, US. Rather, these are big corporates working across the national boundaries. So where do we draw the boundaries? The corporates, given their logic of capitalism to make profit and all the associated uh, aspirations of capitalism, the national boundaries get increasingly blurred with the emergence of these transnational networks, that of big corporate entities. And we also have the new communication technologies coming in, like let's say, for instance, the Facebook or even the digital platforms like Amazon or Netflix, or basically the internet network. That's what Manuel Castells would talk about. In this era of networks, he particularly focuses on the concepts of networks, the digital networks, that of internet. So that is again another major phenomenon that is kind of makes globalization a new sort of a juncture within modernity. Okay, so basically, how do we understand globalization is as a qualitatively new phase in modernity. So, with the advent of transnational networks, global cultural flows, and all these things that I talked about. So, in such a qualitatively new phase in modernity, what happens to our question of identity? How do we define ourselves, or how does the uh, external factors like the nation or the other political entities define you? So this has always been a central concept even within modernity, but with globalization being a qualitatively new phase in modernity with all these new phenomena that I talked about, identity, what happens to the question of identity then? Can we conceive identity as a, of course, we can't conceive it as a unitary, uh, like stable entity, but even within modernity, how do we understand identity with these new phenomenon in globalization? So this has been my central research questions when I did my research. How do we understand identity in a globalizing world? And one of the major political issues of our times is the fact that our discussions of religious identity often gets confined within the realm of culture. For instance, when Hindutva, the RSS talks about the Hindu culture, uh, or Hindu, being Hindu is considered as a cultural identification. And the problem with the academics is when our analytic lens of to understand identity gets confined within the realm of culture. So it is not to suggest that the realm of culture is not important when identity questions are considered, but rather to suggest that the question of identity, when it gets confined within the realm of culture, is a gross mistake, because culturalization of identity uh, is a political project. So, like when you look at when you look at identity as a sociological concept, how do we move beyond the concept of identity? How do you take the question of identity uh, from its exclusive focus on culture? How do we locate it within the realm of economy, within the realm of politics? Of course, we talk about culture and politics together when we talk about identity. But also it is important to understand why and how identity questions are linked to the questions of economy. Especially Wallerstein would argue that globalization as a process itself is an extension of global capitalism. When they move into new territories, when the corporates or the capitalist enterprises move into new territories, that is the prime force behind globalization. Wallerstein would argue this. So in such situations, it's very important to understand identity in the realms of culture, economy, and politics. Of course, these are very broad categories and also not very watertight compartments. But for the purpose of our analysis, to make ourselves very clear about what are we studying, these categories helps. Uh, so now I'll move on to my what I like the research I did on among these Sunni Muslims of Kerala. So I studied their identity articulations, the Sunni Muslims of Kerala, and how they articulate their identity. That was my central, that was my context of research, the specific context of my research, the ethnographic study. So I primarily looked at what are the how do their identity articulation happens in the realm of culture primarily. So that is one major node of my analysis. So culturally, what do they do? How do they articulate their identity in the realm of culture? So this needs a bit of a detailing about who are the Sunni Muslims of Kerala, and what are the other identity sects within Kerala Muslim. It needs a bit of an introduction. That's what I'll be talking about next. So Islamic reformism in Kerala dates back to the early 20th century. That is the general narrative. That it started with activities of religious scholars like Vakam Maulavi, Makti Tangal, etc., who argued for the entry of Muslim women into a mosque, and also who argued for the importance to get secular education, secular in the sense formal education, to the community, and also and not just formal education, also they uh, need to introduce the community to scientific education. And also the reformist impulse had other you know other what you call criticism against the so-called traditional Sunni Muslims, basically the other Muslim sects, saying that the reformists argued that the reformists who basically belong to the Mujahid and Jamaat Islami groups within Kerala, these are the people who are generally categorized under reformists, Islamic reformists. So they argued that many of the traditional beliefs and practices of the Sunni Muslims go against the Tawheed, go against the fundamental tenets of Islam. For instance, they talk about shirk, of attributing partners to God. When you go to a dargah, or when you take part in practices of prophetic love, like Maulud or Nercha, all these practices, they say that it is attributing partners to God and a compromise on Tawheed, or absolute monotheism, belief in a single God. So that is one of the major criticism that the reformists had against the traditionalists. And they also argued that you should access the Quran directly without the intermediaries, without the intermediation of the religious scholars. They argue that the reformists argue that you have to rationally, how do you put it? You have to use the faculty of what is called in Islam as ijtihad, which is that of recent interpretation, and not following the madhabs, means established school of law or the scholars. You should have direct access to Quran and other hadiths and etc., and all the fundamental tenets of Islam. So the reformists believe that it is because that the Sunni Muslims did not follow these fundamental Islamic principles that they are in a state of ignorance, superstition, debauchery, etc. So this was the argument of the reformists from the 1920s onwards, immediately, which got strengthened after the Mapla Rebellion of 1920s. So, the traditionalists counter argue against this sort of reformist formulations. They have been arguing against reformism from 1920s onwards, but it gets a major fillip with during the 1980s period. So that is why I'm locating the advent of globalization as a qualitatively new phase in modernity to the 1980s period. So with what happens in this period is that the traditionalists get a new sort of momentum in their argument against the reformists, because till then the reformism in Kerala context, as Philip Osalla and Caroline Osalla would argue, that Islamic reformism has been always equated with the Kerala modernity, like for instance with its focus on women's entering the mosque, focus on science education and formal education, and with its adherence to the modern, rational, scientific principles, etc. Reformism has always been equated with Kerala modernity and Enlightenment ideals. But from 1980s onwards, the traditionalists would argue that this is not the entire story. That this is you're mimicking the imperialist Western models of progress. So this is not the only way to achieve progress, or this is not the only linear way in modernity. They would argue that there's a different way in which you should understand Islamic reformism and the idea of progress, purogamanam. So what was it? So how do we mark this new traditionalist discourse emerging in 1980s, basically in the context of globalization? How do we mark this new traditionalist discourse emerging from the Sunnis differently from the earlier narratives? So I would argue that there are two major things. One is this new traditionalist discourse would have a epistemological and methodological criticism of Salafi reformism. Second is they question the conventional reformist narratives of Islamic reformism or Islamic Renaissance, Islamic Navodhana. So what is Renaissance? They would ask. The new traditional discourse would ask. So I'll just now move into the first aspect. So what they basically talk about is, so I'm just clubbing up a lot of things into like short sketches. So they would argue that the reformist understanding of religious knowledge, with its emphasis on direct access to Quran and with its emphasis on recent interpretation and negating the intermediaries and negating the importance of ulamas and negating the importance of practices of prophetic love like Maulud and other practices which celebrate prophetic love. The reformist negation behind all this is coming from their admiration to the Western Enlightenment ideals of reason and rationality. And the traditionalists argue why all these practices, which has always been condemned by the reforms, is so central to our understanding of what is to be a Muslim. So, first the new traditionalist discourse would criticize how Islamic reformism is a Western Enlightenment project. That apart, that I'm not going to the details, which we can come into in the discussion section. Second is they would argue that how can you confine the idea of Islamic Renaissance with the 20th century? We have always had reformers dating back to 16th century, like scholars like Mambram Tangal or Makdums, who have fought against the Portuguese during the 16th century. So the idea of Islamic reformism or Renaissance does not begin with the 20th century for the traditionalists. It begins much earlier, in the 16th century and before. So because according to the traditionalists, the reluctance in identifying such movements as Renaissance is because we have a certain colonial mentality to ascribe to notions of Western Enlightenment. So it's primarily an Enlightenment critique of reason, rationality, and progress. So now, what do for instance, in my fieldwork, I interviewed one of this. Not interviewed. I happened to talk with one of the stronghold advocates of the traditionalist position. So it was a Maulud. No, it was a Milad rally, basically, which celebrates the birthday of Prophet Muhammad. So there are these huge processions organized by these traditional Sunni Muslim groups in Kerala. So I participated in one of them, and I casually had a conversation with one of the people who were participating, a very young guy who studies in a traditional daras. So I asked him about him following certain this Maulud and Milad, which is so condemned by the reformists. So his response was very interesting and very telling. So he told me that, see, before the reformists were able to cheat us, saying that Mauluds and all these practices of prophetic love originated in places like Ponnani and other places, and these are not true Islam. And he says that now we can easily contest it by just Googling Maulud celebration, Egypt, Tunisia, Malaysia, UK, etc. So we know that these are not practices exclusively followed only in Kerala. Rather, these are practices found in many places which follow Islamic faith. So he had no, he was very confident in celebrating all these so-called traditional religious practices. So how do we understand this newfound confidence among the Sunni Muslims to practices to follow such practices which are so condemned by the reformists, because they see it as integral to their conception of identity, their Muslim religious identity. They don't have much confusions over it now. So this is just a snippet that I wanted to share with you. And also, when you look at the publications that the traditionalist Muslims, publishes, so you find mentions like, I'm not reading it out, but so there'll be like these small booklets on Mauluds and Milads and other like dargahs, etc. So they argue even in places like Saudi Arabia, how people from different nationalities, people who have come for their work, actively and very enthusiastically take part in such religious practices. So if you look at the reformist argumentation, so it is basically saying that, see, all these practices that you follow, these are not found in the Islamic scriptures, primarily Quran. So these are un-Islamic. So that was the reformist argument. So now what we see among the traditionalists is that it is not, so the traditionalists would argue that how you understand Islam, how you understand Islam as a uh, belief entity itself is problematic. Your epistemological understanding of Islam itself is problematic. That is what the traditionalists would tell a reformist group. Because they say the knowledge in Islam has always been embodied according to the traditionalists. For instance, how you cannot separate uh, the smell of a flower from the flower itself. So that is how knowledge is embodied in Islam. So that is the traditionalist argument. Basically, they cites many Islamic scholars like Imam Ghazali and others, and how they understood Islamic knowledge to legitimize this argument. And so knowledge according to the traditionalists is not just a instrumental entity. Rather, it is passed over through generations of scholars. They call that the question of sanad, that is the chain of transmission. That is so important in the credibility of knowledge according to the traditionalists. So knowledge is not something that you can, get from just reading the text without a proper guidance from the religious scholar. That is what the traditionalists would argue. And the traditionalists also insist that all the problems of reformism, Salafi reformism, like ISIS, for instance, or are located in a wrong understanding of Islamic knowledge. With all the direct access to Quran, with the development of print technologies and internet and all that, you can just Google Islam. Online Islam is what they call. That, according to the traditionalists, is very problematic and end up in very wrong interpretations of the Islamic faith, which unfortunately gets symbolized as the Islam in the global context due to various political reasons. So this is what the traditionalists is arguing against reformist Islam in the realm of culture. So what are they arguing to summarize it? So if the reformist argument earlier was that of true Islam, that these are the practices that are to be followed if you were to be called a true Muslim, uh, that was the if you have to strictly follow the scriptures. But in the new traditionalist discourse, what we see is a new form of authenticating tradition. New form of authenticating tradition, which is not solely dependent on the scriptures like Quran or Hadith, but rather the new traditionalist discourse have complex references to the idea of personification of authority, how the knowledge is embodied in the ulama, and also how practices of prophetic love is integral to their Islamic belief itself. Munir Khudri has a very interesting paper on how practices of Maulud, etc., are integral in the formation of Muslim moral ethical community in Kerala. So, so these are integral according to the traditionalists. So they are not just dependent on the concept of true Islam and it coming from scriptures, but rather they have what I call articulation of true Islamicate global imaginations. So I take this concept of Islamicate from Hodson's idea of Islamicate in his book, The Venger of Islam. So Islamicate refers to complex social and cultural entities or complexes found in Islamic geographies across the world. So it is so when you say something is Islamic and when you say something is Islamicate, it's fundamentally different. So Islamicate, one second, I'll just read the idea of Islamicate as one second. Yeah. So yeah. So So when I use the word true Islamicate global imaginations, I use it as imaginations of particular social and cultural complex historically associated with Islam and Muslim societies in diverse geographies as representing Islam's authentic, universal, and plural character. So, while the reformist ideas of true Islam carry global Islamic impulses towards purification, the traditionalist argument about true Islamicate global uh, try to embed the religious practices within the cultural context of its existence. So, just because a religious practice is embedded within its cultural context of its existence, doesn't make it un-Islamic. According to them, that is what makes it Islamic in its true, universal, plural form. So it's a new mode of argument which is not confined to Islamic scriptures, but also uh, provides interesting reflections on how Islam understands self and how Islam understands uh, the authority, how Islam understands the personified forms of authority, etc. So it's a very novel, if I can say, interpretation of Islam when it comes to the mainstream arguments. Of course, this has been very relevant and prominent within the Sufi traditions. I'm talking about how it has become so prominent in the mainstream Muslim discourse in Kerala. So this true Islamicate global imaginations is not confined to Kerala or India or any such artificially created modern and national boundaries. Rather, it derives inspiration and it has references to similar practices across the world. Yemen, Malaysia, you take anywhere in the world, the reference, you can see references to such geographies. So what you can see is a certain spatial reimagination of your identity. Your identity is not confined within the boundaries of the nation state or the state boundaries or whatever. Rather, your identity is equally determined uh, by boundaries which go beyond the nation state. So this is a very important methodological, uh, you know, methodologically relevant point, because often sociologically when we speak, we are confined in our imagination to the nation state. All our questions starts and ends with the understanding of nation state. So this is not to suggest that the modern nation states are not any more relevant. Rather, it has become very relevant, as we see in the case of Citizenship Amendment Act, or in Ayodhya, or in many other instances. The nation state has become so relevant, but still, the conception of identity is not anymore confined within the national boundaries. That is the argument I am making. So how do we go beyond methodological nationalism in our understanding of identity is so important, because we have already had enough romanticization of this idea of nationalism, which is backfiring now as a certain cultural nationalism from the Hindutva groups. So how do we critically look at the whole concept of nationalism is also integral in our understanding of religious identity articulations, is my point. So I'll move on. So these are the cultural, this is what happening within the realm of culture in the case of Sunni traditionalists. And now I'll quickly mention about the economic part, and then I'll stop there. So normally, as I said, identity gets confined within this realm of culture. But how do we understand identity in relation to the economic restructuring that we are going through? Because globalization is not merely a cultural phenomenon where you can watch Netflix and Amazon, but rather globalization is also marked by a neoliberal restructuring of the entire economy. For instance, when I looked at some of the materials that the traditional Sunni Muslims produce, I came across several references to the economic underpinnings. For instance, I'll read out a small snippet from my fieldwork. So the Marcus Excellency Club, which is run by one of the most prominent Sunni sects in Kerala, has this introduction. I quote, to promote Sharia compliant investment portfolio in property development, hospitality, conventions, industrial enterprises, and to offer portfolio management. Marcus Excellency Club is set to establish a Sharia Business Advisory Council and Sharia Authentication Cell for promoting Islamic principles within the community and beyond to promote a strategic policy dialogue platform for Islamic banking in Indian economy. So, so this itself shows that articulation of religious identity is not merely about religious identity, but rather constitutive of how we see our economic structuring. And if you look at not just this particular Muslim identity group that I'm talking about, but even if you look at such similar formations across religions, like for instance Amardandamai, Madham, or even similar. I'm not mentioning all of them. There are plenty in the Indian context. So all of them, how do they take part in developmental activities? How do they present themselves as torch bearers of progress and development? Is very important. If Amardandamai talks about seva, Muslim identity groups will derive inspiration from some other concepts of religious ethics within their religion. I'm also casually just mentioning the case of Marcus Knowledge City, which is a 100-acre integrated township for living, leisure, and learning that promises a lifestyle solution. These are all in quotes. That promises a lifestyle solution. This is coming up in Calicut via National Highway in the outskirts of Calicut. So the official website of the Knowledge City project by this traditional Sunni group says, over the past few decades, the global economy has shifted from being manufacturing-centric to a knowledge-driven one. This is an era of privatization and globalization of Indian higher education. Success in leveraging knowledge and innovation that could contribute to high-tech manufacturing and high value-added services is only possible with a sound infrastructure of higher education. This is another instance. And similarly, if you look at the Relief and Charitable Foundation of India, run by the same group that I studied, they talk about how the notion of well-being and progress is an individual responsibility rather than the responsibility of the state. So basically, a common thread that is found across all these identitarian religious groups, which claims authentic as torchbearers of authentic traditions, is that they all talk about individual responsibilities rather than the state responsibility to provide basic development services. So one of the major transformations in neoliberal economy is this. How do you put it? Is this taking away the responsibility of welfare from the state and putting the onus on the individuals or the groups. So the state is the idea of state is sort of relatively underplayed here. State is not anymore the only provider of development. Rather, development and notions of well-being all becomes individual responsibilities, which is a major characteristic of a neoliberal restructuring of the economy. It promotes values of entrepreneurship, efficiency, management, and it doesn't have much reference to the questions of equity or social justice. If you look at any of these religious identity groups, whether it be Amardandamai or any other groups, there is hardly any talk about structural reformation of our economy. There's not much mention about the question of equity or social justice. All that they talk about in terms of economy is to attract investments, build new colleges, build new investment portfolios, etc. So the question of identity in case of Islam, Bona Attia and other scholars have called this pious neoliberalism. The quality of being pious, the quality of being religiously pious is marked by certain embracing of the values of neoliberal notions of governmentality and neoliberal notions of private entrepreneurship, etc. But of course, these are all projected as major things of community development and progress. But where is the question of community development and progress taken seriously? For instance, if you talk to a common man from the community or common person from a community about getting access to these big projects that are being set up in the name of promoting Islamic heritage and tradition, you'll get the real picture. How even the basic access to such huge commercial entrepreneurial projects is based on your financial financial power, basically. So is this the community empowerment that we are talking about? Is one of the major questions. How do we critically understand these religious organizations claim as development providers? Especially in the neoliberal context, this is very important because the space that these religious organizations occupy, that of voluntary sector of providing development, is often constitutive of their identitarian claims. This is how they legitimize themselves as uh, true carriers of tradition, especially in a relatively developed state like Kerala. Because if you merely talk about religion all the time, nobody's going to take you seriously. If you can talk about education, empowerment, etc., the gender question that I'll come in the discussion, only then your identitarian claims will get justified. So this is very important. So what I've tried to, I don't know, I've been very sketchy in my mapping of this entire thing. I think in the discussion part, I hope it will become better. But so my point basically is how to understand the question of religious identity, which is often projected as a cultural project. How do we understand that without confining it to the realm of culture? Because culturalization of religious identity is politically dangerous, as we have seen in the case of Hindutva or any other groups. Instead, we have to locate it in the realm of culture, but also, and importantly, of politics and economy. Without that, our critical edge to look at identity, as Brubaker and Cooper would argue, that our critical insight into the concept of identity will get lost. Rather, we will be reifying, we'll be legitimizing all the identitarian claims over tradition and whatnot. And I kind of highlight this partly because in anthropology of Islam, with the Talal Asad and Sabah Mahmud and all other schools coming in, there has been a propagation, almost like a propaganda of a decontextualized analysis of Muslim identities, which kind of exceptionalize the Muslim community as something like a museum piece, that this is so distinct to Muslim community, this is so unique to Muslim community. That is very dangerous in sociological analysis of any religious community. So how do we move beyond this? So one of the scholars, Samuel Shirke, argues that there is too much of Islam in anthropology of Islam these days. There is too much of Islam. Likewise, when we talk about here the Hindutva identity, all that we talk about is how they project certain notions of Hindu culture. But how do we liberate our analytical lens from what they want us to believe, what the propagandists would want us to believe? How do we move beyond such culturalist arguments? Because that is more than academic, or rather, it is equally relevant academically and politically to move beyond such understanding. In the case of Islam, what I've understood is that it is very relevant to de-exceptionalize the study of Muslim communities, because de-exceptionalizing Islam or any other religious community is integral, or rather fundamental, in a sociological view of religious identity, especially in globalized context where we no longer live one single life. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. The floor is open to discussion. The participants can unmute themselves to ask questions or post their question in the comment box.
Myself, Dr. Manoj. Very excellent and informative lecture, sir. And I am really impressed by your lecture, sir. But my question is, sir, we are residing in India. And you know very well that the partition of the country is based on religion based. And how we can separate politics from religion, sir? Please, sir.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So if you ask me how we can do it, I don't have of course, I don't have a clear answer how do we separate. But I think separating religion and politics is very important. For instance,